In September 2022, the Nord Stream pipeline, which had been delivering gas from Russia to Germany, was blown up. It was clear that it was sabotage, but until now, it was never clear who was behind it. This week, we've seen compelling evidence that it was actually Ukrainian operatives in that operation. I'm Cindy Yu, I'm the Spectator's assistant editor, and joining me to discuss what we know so far is Owen Matthews, Spectator contributor and author of Overreach, the inside story of Putin's war against Ukraine. Now, to start with, Owen, could you remind viewers of the Nord Stream bombing and the discussions at the time about, the theories that were going around about what actually happened?
So just let's cast our minds back to what was happening in September of 2022. The Russians had invaded in February. The Ukrainians had stopped that advance, and the Russians had withdrawn, but nonetheless from around Kiev. But nonetheless, in that summer, there was a lot of positional warfare in the east of Ukraine. And crucially, there was a lot of pressure, diplomatic pressure from Russia on Europe, specifically attempting to leverage gas supplies. And in that summer of 2022, Russia shut down unilaterally, supposedly for technical reasons, the gas supply through the Nord Stream pipeline, which supplied Germany with about 30% of its natural gas needs. It's an enormously expensive set of pipelines. Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, they're about 9 to 10 billion euros each. Their building was very controversial because it meant that Germany's economy was very heavily dependent on Gazprom gas from Russia. And the philosophy from the German side was, if we tie in the Kremlin to German European money, then the Kremlin is less likely to be an international disruptor. Now, that logic may have been sound in principle, but as it turns out in 2022, it became very clear that we're dealing with not necessarily an irrational actor, but a Putin-controlled Kremlin that thinks that its perceived national security of Russia is more important than economic considerations. But what happens in September of 2022 is that all of those negotiations, all of that effectively energy blackmail by the Kremlin of Europe comes to an abrupt halt because somebody blows up 3 of the 4 Nord Stream pipelines, releasing a huge amount of highly pressurized natural gas into the atmosphere, and essentially cutting off Germany from its major supply of Russian gas, and simultaneously cutting off the main lever of influence that Russia had been using as a diplomatic tool in order to further its aims in Ukraine via pressure on Europe.
And at the time, who did people think that was behind the bombing?
The Russians said it was the Americans. Many people said that it was the Russians. Many people in the West said it was the Russians. That they, I think that neither of those things really made sense. The actual truth that began to emerge pretty soon, actually, after the explosion, in terms of investigations, and already the German and Polish police were starting to, and the Swedish authorities were starting to focus not on some major submarine, highly sophisticated plot, but actually on something that is surprisingly simple and low tech. And that was a group of divers that just literally jumped over the side of a boat, went down to 90 meters, placed charges, and blew up those pipelines. And it became clear already by November of 2022 to the German police that those people who did it were Ukrainians. And what's happened now? The Spectator, I wrote a story last spring after a very long investigation, basically telling the story of how the German investigators were pursuing a group of Polish private citizens and who they believed to be responsible. They had hired a yacht called the Andromeda, just a private pleasure yacht, and their movements have been tracked. And also, I reported for the Spectator on the technical side of this, and actually it was amply confirmed by lots of professionals that in fact blowing up a pipe like Nord Stream is in fact relatively, from a technical point of view, easy task. It's not very thick. It's less than 3 centimeters of steel. That sounds like a lot, but actually 3 centimeters of steel and 10 centimeters of concrete, which is highly pressurized internally to about 120 atmospheres bar on the inside, does not require hundreds of kilograms of explosives. Maybe 10 kilos of explosives. Relatively simple demolition job. And the reason why we're talking about this today is that there's been a very major investigation reporting effort from the Wall Street Journal that has just broken the news a couple of days ago that the Germans have had in June issued already their first formal arrest warrant for a suspect. And the Poles, who were supposed to arrest this suspect, instead let him go. And the Germans are annoyed about that. So clearly, that very outlandish sounding theory that like literally a tiny group of Ukrainian saboteurs acting in a sort of semi-private capacity could have done this is being substantiated. And the new part of the story that's emerged is that apparently Vladimir Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, approved this, according to the Wall Street Journal's reporting.
Yes, absolutely. So even though they were non-state operatives, they did seem to have the blessing of the state. And actually, it seems like they had some training, and there were some active soldiers in that group of 6 as well.
That's right. The strangest part of the story is the sort of shape of this weird sort of public-private partnership that put this together. So, according to as yet unsubstantiated reporting by the Wall Street Journal, there was a group of Ukrainians who got together back in May of 2022, literally sort of around a dinner table, put together this crazy sounding plan. Then eventually actually got the financing, got the logistics, and went to the political side, Zelensky, and actually got the operational backing of Valentin Zaluzhny, who is the chief of the Ukrainian armed forces and is now Ukraine's ambassador to London. So the really strange twist in the tale is, although Zelensky had supposedly signed off on this sabotage operation, Zaluzhny had signed off on it. But the Dutch intelligence and then later American intelligence got wind of the operation and tried to shut it down. Again, according to the Wall Street Journal, the Zelensky attempted to stop the sabotage group and was told by his chief of military chief, Zaluzhny, that they were already out of communications and they're already out and running and they couldn't be stopped, which is kind of a strange story.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the bit that stands out the most to me, that the CIA knew about it, supposedly, if this reporting is true. The CIA knew about it and asked Zelensky to call it off. And Zelensky's head of the armed forces said no. I mean, what does that say about Zelensky's authority in this kind of wartime operation? We see him as very much the leader in charge, but is he really in charge? Sorry to interrupt the show, but if you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
Well, we don't know the extent to which there is, to which everyone is telling, was telling the Americans the truth about this, because of course, if you really wanted this to happen, and if you as Zelensky wanted this sabotage operation to go ahead, but you also quite fancied, having $60 billion of aid. That's exactly what you would say. You would say I'm sorry, like I told them not to, but they did it anyway. So that's, sounds, highly, highly self-serving, which doesn't mean it's not true, but it is very convenient for the Zelensky narrative to say that, he attempted to cool it off, but actually already, the sort of the torpedo was running, as it were. The person who can really put some, substantiate or otherwise this is Valery Zaluzhny, who is now your neighbor in London, but I doubt very much, for many reasons, that he will actually be forthcoming. But someday the truth will come out.
Yes, well, maybe we should try to interview him on Spectator TV. But as I understand it, the Ukrainians have obviously denied a lot of this. But Owen, why is it so important to get to the bottom of who was actually behind this bombing? What are the stakes here?
Well, it's interesting actually. There's one of the weirdest things is that the sort of very strongly pro-Ukraine lobby has gone from at the beginning, right after the explosions back in 2022, saying it was definitely the Russians and definitely not NATO and definitely not the Ukrainians, to now suddenly turning, doing 180 and saying, like, wasn't it brilliant the Ukrainians did this? Like, this was like the greatest thing ever.
Right.
Like, bully for them.
A feat of heroism.
Yeah, and it is, in fact, if you think about it, I reckon that this is the most successful and significant special operation in the history of warfare. I think it's really hard to think of another example of a special operation, a secret special operation, that has had the enormous geopolitical impact that the Nord Stream destruction had. So in that sense, it was actually an enormous success because, let's be very clear, the destruction of Nord Stream basically burnt a bridge for Europe and for Germany. It made it impossible to restore Gazprom's energy domination in Europe. Physically impossible. The infrastructure was gone. And from that point of view, actually, it became a really important part of Ukraine's efforts to maintain its Western backers and sort of, essentially, make sure that there was no backsliding on their part. However, the means they chose to do that was literally a military attack on the critical infrastructure of a key NATO ally. And there's been various voices in Germany quoted in the German press in reaction to this new Wall Street Journal revelation, saying that this is like an act of war. It's really an act of war. If it had been proved that an enemy like Russia had done this, this would have been potentially of a magnitude to trigger NATO Article 5 collective security response. I mean, this is really an extraordinarily violent, damaging, and strategically big and economically catastrophic act of war against Germany perpetrated by the Ukrainian government.
Owen Matthews, thank you very much for joining Spectator TV.